What is the craziest / scariest thing you've ever experienced as an anthropologist? Okay, my name is Lara. My middle name is Shelley. Don't tell anyone that. Lara Shelley Rosenoff Gauvin. I'm a cultural anthropologist in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Manitoba. I think just encountering people's racism, to be honest, is always scary and crazy. Like, I don't really understand it. Racism and violence. Like, I worked for a long time on violence and how people move past violence or live through violence, and I think to me it's not understandable why people commit violence, and so many people have to live through it in our world, and that it's just kind of accepted as part of the way that our society functions. I know that's probably a heavier answer than what you meant, but yeah, and that's it. And sometimes I'm just shocked by the racism that I then encounter when I talk about these things. What research are you currently doing? So currently I am nurturing and co-chairing something that's called the Respectful Repatriation Ceremony at the University of Manitoba. And that concerns respectful repatriation and caregiving for ancestors, belongings, human biological materials, tangible and intangible cultural expressions that the university has been stewarding, possibly without proper consent or consultation, sometimes for decades or a century. And so my work is really as a part of that ceremony in working with elders and community to find positive ways forward. How is anthropology important in our daily lives? / why should people care about anthropology? Okay, so I think anthropology is important in everybody's daily lives because you really try to put yourself in someone else's perspective, and you try to understand based on someone who grew up with completely, possibly different life experiences, what they might be experiencing in their daily life and how you can better understand that. And sometimes you're working in your own community or within your own community, and then you're still working with people who you might know your whole life and who have had very similar experiences to also understand, why they see the world a certain way, why you see the world a certain way. And I think in the end, it's that interior aspect of cultural anthropology, I would say, that you see yourself also as formed by your experiences, whether they be socioeconomic, whether they be race, where you were born, what languages you have spoken, a whole variety of experiences that you had growing up really forms who you are and your perspectives and opinions and experiences of our world. So that's why I think people should care about anthropology. More relationship, more understanding between people, and more conversation, I think, is always better. Why did you get into anthropology, or when did you learn about anthropology? This is a funny story. So when I was in university, I did my bachelor's in communication studies, actually. And I did documentary filmmaking. But I was always interested in the stories people told. And again, in understanding different perspectives and different societies. And I think partially it was I looked around where I grew up and how I was growing up, and I said, there's got to be something better about this. I kind of thought that the world I lived in didn't make too much sense to me. But I was in communication studies, and then I ended up working for a long time in the film industry. And again, you're wondering, how did this lead to anthropology? Still not the answer yet, but I ended up going back to school to do a Master of Fine Arts in Documentary Media. But because of that work, I ended up working with one girl in northern Uganda during the war there. So I was there from 2004 to about 2006 at the beginning, just staying with her in an internally displaced persons camp and understanding her own view of the war and how she was living through it. And I decided to go back to do my master's in documentary media, and then continuing working with her through from 2006 then to 2008. the war ended, people were returning home, and she, we became friends, obviously. We had known each other for a long time and were working together. She had a lot of questions that we would talk about what returning home meant to her. Like, she grew up in the war. She was born into the war. She grew up in the displacement camp. She had been abducted. The rebel group came back to the displacement camp. She didn't know what home was, and so she was really interested in that, and we would talk about it, and she would talk to the neighbors in the camp about it. And I always said, I never thought I would want to do a PhD, trust me. I was out of there after my BA. But I said, oh wow, like that's a really interesting point about, surviving violence and what it means to be normal when all you have known is this violence. And I think about my own upbringing. My grandparents survived the Holocaust, and so those experiences of violence were always very much a part of my own upbringing and how I understood them and how I understand my own place in the world. And my grandmother was the one who, paid for us to go to a Jewish school, and we had a Jewish education. And for her, this education of, I could say, of like a Jewish home or of a Jewish culture was really important in her own recovery after the violence. And so talking with Beatrice, that was the name of the woman I worked with, and hearing all these questions from her, I said, that's a really interesting perspective. It made me think about my own upbringing, but then just generally how we live through violence and what it means. Like, what does the cultural underpinnings of home and our lives mean in terms of surviving that? And so I decided to apply for a PhD, more that I could just be with her and see as people went back home and be able to put more time into it. And when I was thinking about what should I do a PhD in, and someone said, that really sounds like anthropology. I said, it does? Like, yeah, that really sounds like cultural anthropology. You should read, I think it was like Carolyn Nordstrom at the time. So I read Carolyn Nordstrom's book, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is fascinating. Can't remember the name of the book. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah. And so I started reading more and more in anthropology about violence and surviving violence and social repair and Indigenous knowledge and cultural traditions or cultural heritage and context. And I said, okay, I think maybe then, yeah, the PhD should be in anthropology. But I had never taken an anthropology class before. Another secret. So anyways, I applied and I got into UBC to go to do a PhD in anthropology, and I did a bunch of makeup classes because I didn't have the background, and it did indeed give me really interesting tools to think about and to work with community on those questions. Cats or dogs? Cats. Totally cats. I grew up with dogs, but then I got my first cat in my 20s when I had an apartment, and yeah, they just suit me. And I used to travel a lot too and wasn't at home so much, and so having cats also suited that. But they also were just like, they don't need you so much, but they're like your companion. I think they think more that you're like, they're taking care of you in a way, and so that kind of works, and we're just a family. So yes, I have a cat now, Lucy, who's she's been with us since 2016, and before that I had two cats. My first two cats were Shiva and Janice, and they lived till they were 18 years old. My friends in Uganda who I work with were just horrified / thought it was funny that I had cats that lived to be 18 and that they would live inside the house. But they were very sweet too. And my husband is very much an old cat lady, more than me. How does your research impact people? That's a good question. I think it's almost what we were just talking about in terms of it's about relationships. And I would say specifically always respectful relationships, but really in terms of respectful repatriation and caregiving, really forging different kinds of relationships between the university and particularly Indigenous descendant communities. And so it's really about that respect and what someone called like a debt of respect. I think that's been owed to Indigenous communities by settler colonial institutions. And a debt of respect is a nice way of talking about, centuries of violence and genocide. Definitely university institutions are a part of that. And so does the research impact people? I hope that, respectful relationships do impact people, not only descendant communities, but also in the way that the university thinks about research and their impact in their own relationships with communities. What is your favorite movie and why? Okay, so when I was sent these questions, I was like, I thought that's a really hard question. What is my favorite movie? I love going to the movies. Like, I love going with the kids and buying popcorn, and I like the experience of sitting in the cinema, and I almost like it better than watching them at home. I really enjoy that. And as I spoke about earlier, I did do, my bachelor was in communications in film specifically, and so I made documentary films. And I also had to take a lot of film theory classes. And so I was thinking about what is my favorite film. And like, I like blockbusters. I like going to all of them. I like art house films. I like Indigenous films. I like Marvel films. I like them all. But then I was thinking of what is my actual favorite film. And here it is. It's probably why I went into film for my bachelor's, is we watched, it's really obscure. His name is Dziga Vertov, and he's a really, really early filmmaker. Documentary. It was experimental documentary. You could look it up. And the movie is called The Man with the Movie Camera. And he really experimented with film as a form. And so it was, he was the first one to do like jump cuts or doing different Dutch angles together, and the way he played with the film itself. And he worked with his wife, and his brother was the camera guy, and his wife was the editor. And they were really just artists exploring the film medium in the early 1900s. And so I'm sure you can find it on YouTube. Check it out. The Man with the Movie Camera, Dziga Vertov. I think that is my favorite movie in the end. What is your favorite class to teach? That's a hard one. I'm not going to say I like teaching all my classes, because that is not true. But I love teaching the intro class. I love teaching 1220, Intro to Cultural Anthropology, because first of all, there's a lot of people in the class, and for some people, it's the only time they're going to take an anthropology class. And so I feel like it's an opportunity, when I was talking about before what anthropology could give you, that shifting of a perspective, changing the center from which you see the world. And for me, if I have like 200 students who may never take another anthropology class, and that's, they're doing nursing or business or architecture, I have that course to just show them a little bit about what that feels like and how good that may be. And so I do love teaching the intro class. That being said, I also like teaching fourth year grad classes, and I love teaching this museums class called Museums Memory Witnessing that I've been doing here. But I've really enjoyed my Anthropology of Land class. I even, gosh knows how, like my contemporary theory class, which I never thought I would enjoy teaching contemporary theory. But I actually really enjoyed teaching it also. And I think part of it is that as a professor, and I think it's the part of being a professor that really surprised me, is just how creative course creation is and can be, which when you go through school, it isn't really what's emphasized. It's your research and it's writing and proposals. But, teaching is a lot of what you do. And just the creativity that goes into the creation of a syllabus, and then the even assignments. Like, it's a very creative, it's almost like curating a show, right? Like, you're curating an experience for students. And so I just love it. I really enjoy it. So I like teaching them all. What is your favorite and least favorite thing about your job? I'm going to start with least favorite. My least favorite thing about my job is navigating university bureaucracy. Though I'm learning. And just, you have something very simple. You want to give someone an honoraria, like a little gift for coming to a meeting. And now, of course, I know how to do it, and it's relatively simple, but to find out how to do that and what the university needs from you, and whether they're temporary or human resources, or whether it's a contract, or whether it's this, and if they make more than 500, like, there's so many different rules for something so simple. So I would say that is absolutely the least favorite part of my job, is navigating university bureaucracy. And the favorite part of my job is really that I get to work with people all the time, and whether it's students or community members or elders with respectful repatriation, or colleagues on like group work. Like, I think for me, it's the absolutely best thing about being an assistant professor, is that you have such a diversity of things that you're doing, and for me they could all be creative in different ways, and that they're really relationship based. So I would say that's the best part of my job. My favorite. I like that this one's written in pink. What is one thing that boggles your mind about humans that you would love to be explained? We're going to get heavier here. I mean, it comes back to the violence. I think I've researched violence, and it's formed is that it's not seen as something, it's seen as something bad, for sure, in our society, yet it keeps going in different forms, and whether that's domestic violence or murder or outright war, it's not seen as something, of a mental illness, for example. It's not so much. It's seen as a crime in many ways, but it's very much a part of our society and the way that our society functions. And I think that it just, it boggles my mind that people in power, that anyone, and I understand it's more complex and there's trauma and re-traumatization and what you've lived through, and I understand it. I think if you look to leadership, though, I think it boggles my mind, to use your word, that leaders can commit such acts of violence. And that, sure, there could be condemnation and everyone's in an outrage, but economics trumps violence in our society. And it boggles my mind that we think that is not only acceptable, but civilized, to use a very outdated term, that I think people would still apply in that situation. Any final comments, thoughts? It'd be good to end on an uplifting note. Yes. Sorry. I always do that in my classes too. Heavy issues. Okay, I think we'll just bring it back to people themselves and, connection between people and being able to understand each other, and if not understand completely, then empathize. And I guess that would be my final thought, and only because I don't want to leave on a note of violence and, mental instability, I would say, that I've just called our society out for, is that humans are also capable of immense connection, incredible connection and relationships. And so I guess I would just want to end it with